Hey folks, thanks for joining me for this episode from the Embellish Pod. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists, and if you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com, and I'll get that taken care of. You can also find video versions of this podcast on YouTube. You can find all of my links on Instagram at embellishpod or TikTok with the same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. It is 1994, and the last light is literally going out on the Bruichladdich distillery. After 113 years of continuous whiskey making, the accountants have spoken. Surplus requirements, they said. The Victorian machinery that had hummed with purpose for over a century had fell silent. The island held its breath. But here's what I love about the whiskey world. It's full of people who see magic where others see spreadsheets. Fast forward to December of 2000. A wine merchant named Mark Rainier is walking through those empty halls with a master distiller, Jim McEwen. And they're not seeing a failed business. They're seeing a sleeping beauty. The equipment had not been modernized, Rainier would later say, which meant it hadn't been ruined. Those cast iron mash tuns that had corporate efficiency experts wanting to scrap them, they were actually priceless relics that could recreate or create flavors that are impossible to achieve with modern stainless steel. 5 months of restoration followed. Every bolt, every pipe, every piece of Victorian brass was lovingly brought back to life. And on May 29th, 2001, when that first New Spirit make flowed from those ancient stills, something remarkable happened. They hadn't just saved a distillery, they'd proven that innovation and tradition could dance together. The story captures everything I love about whiskey making. It's not just about the liquid in the bottle. It's about stubborn, passionate people who refuse to let authenticity die, who see potential where others see problems, and who understand that some things are worth fighting for. Today we're exploring this extraordinary island where peat smoke tells stories of ancient forests, where Atlantic storms shape every drop of whiskey, and where traditions survive, not because they're old, but because they're irreplaceable. Welcome to Islay, and once you taste what's in this 25-mile-long island, you'll never forget the name either, or the flavor for that matter. What fascinates me about Islay is how it punches so far above its weight. We're talking about a windswept rock in the Atlantic that is home to just over 3,000 people, yet it produces some of the most distinctive, memorable whiskeys on earth. 9 active distilleries on an island you can drive across in an hour. That's not just impressive, it's almost impossible. But here's the thing that really gets me. Islay doesn't just make whiskey, it creates liquid terroir. And I know that's a wine term, but stay with me. Every single element of this island's environment, from the ancient peat that formed over 10,000 years to the salt air that penetrates every warehouse wall, it contributes to the flavors that you literally cannot create elsewhere. Now, let's talk about the peat for a moment, because it's not just fuel, it's compressed history. While mainland Scottish peat comes from heather and grasses, Islay's peat comes from remnants of ancient oak, birch, and other hardwoods, from forests that existed when mammoths roamed Scotland. When you taste that smoke, you're literally experiencing flavors from another geological age. And then there's the Atlantic. Islay distillers don't fight the weather, they collaborate with it. Those legendary storms that can keep ferries away for days, they're also driving salt deep into warehouse walls, creating maturation conditions that mainland distilleries spend fortunes trying to replicate. What really impresses me about modern Islay is how each distillery found its own interpretation of these shared elements. You've got southern coastline, Ardbeg, Lagavulin, and Laphroaig, creating these intensely medicinal, phenolic whiskeys that make you either a convert or send you running. Then there's the gentler north approach in the Bunnahabhain or Caol Ila, where maritime character takes precedence over peat intensity. But it's Bruichladdich on the western shore that really challenges assumptions. One day they're making completely unpeated whiskey that showcases pure barley character. The next, they're distilling Octomore at phenol levels that would make other distillers weep. Same stills, same water, same island, completely different philosophies. The diversity within a shared identity is what makes Islay so compelling. It's not about making heavily peated whiskeys, though they certainly excel at that. It's about understanding how place shapes flavor, how tradition enables innovation, and how community of makers can push each other toward excellence while maintaining their individual voices. So let's get on to tonight's lineup. First, we'll start with Gordon and McPhail Caol Ila 13 year. Now, we start here because it's likely the gentlest. Caol Ila typically runs around 35 to 40 parts per million of peat. Gordon and McPhail bottlings are often around 43 to 46%. It really gives us a nice introduction to Islay smoke without overwhelming a palate. Next, we move to the Bowmore Master Selection 3rd edition. This is the 2024 edition. Now, this one will use around 20 to 25 parts per million of peat, but their spirit has a really distinctive Bowmore complexity that potentially has tropical fruit notes. And even though it is less peated than the first bottle, the flavor profile is going to be seen as more intense, potentially coming from a number of reasons, but also including the idea that it is going to be 51 to 54% ABV. Next, we'll move into the Bruichladdich Port Charlotte 10 year. Now, this is a significant step up. Port Charlotte is going to sit near 40 parts per million of peat and 50% alcohol by volume. And this is where we're starting to get into a more heavily peated territory, but it is still approachable, potentially, compared to what's going to happen next. Now, last but certainly not least, we're going to have Octomore 14.4. We are saving potentially the best for last. This is a massive 106.6 parts per million. At 61.8% ABV, this is a cask strength offering, and this is one of the most heavily peated whiskeys that I have available to me. And the high proof is going to potentially amplify everything. Your palate would struggle to appreciate the subtleties of the others if we had done this one first. And I want to say a special thank you to a friend, Tony, for providing this sample to me. Now, all of these samples were provided by a number of friends, whether it be Don or whether it be David, whether it be Patrick. A lot of friends have enabled this journey, and so thank you guys so very much. Before we dive into these whiskeys, let's talk a little bit about the delivery system tonight. This is the Tuath glass, and I'm always curious about how different glassware is going to affect the experience. And this is actually an Irish-designed glass, and we're going to drink Scottish whiskeys. This should be an interesting experience. The Tuath, or pronounced Tua, it means people or tribe in Old Irish. It was specifically designed for use for Irish whiskey. Its creators made some intriguing choices that could enhance any whiskey experience. Now, let me walk you through what makes this glass unique and how it might affect our Islay exploration. First, size matters. The Tua is notably larger than a standard Glencairn glass, and it has a wider opening and a taller bowl. For tonight's heavily peated whiskeys, this extra volume could be beneficial. More space means more surface area for the whiskey to breathe, potentially allowing some of those complex peat compounds to evolve and separate as they reach the nose. The flared rim is particularly clever. Traditional nosing glasses concentrate aromas which can be overwhelming with higher proof items. Heavily peated spirits like our Octomore 14.1 at nearly 120 proof specifically. The Tuath's design should soften those alcohol burn notes while still delivering the aromatic complexity that we want to experience. I'm also intrigued by the ergonomics. That distinctive base, inspired by Ireland's Skellig Michael, is designed for a 3-finger grip that promotes 360-degree visual analysis. For our range tonight, from the McPhail Caol Ila to the deeper amber of the aged Bowmore, being able to appreciate the color differences easily could enhance the overall experience. However, there are some other considerations for tonight's lineup. The wider opening that works beautifully for softer Irish whiskeys might actually diminish the impact of Islay's more subtle maritime notes. Those delicate sea salt and seaweed characteristics that define a Caol Ila could get lost in the extra airspace. For our Octomore, ironically, the gentler delivery might work against us. Part of the Octomore experience is that initial phenolic assault. It is supposed to be intense, and the Tuath more forgiving approach might soften what is meant to be a bold statement. The larger capacity also means that we'll naturally pour more generous measures, which could be problematic with our high-proof selections. The beauty of a smaller Glencairn is that it encourages restraint, something to keep in mind as we work through 4 substantial whiskeys tonight. What excites me about using the Tuath tonight is the opportunity to test whether this glass design can bridge regional differences. Irish and Scottish whiskey making share deep historical roots, but have evolved into distinct character profiles. Can a glass designed for one tradition enhance appreciation of another? We'll be on the watch out for how the Tuath affects things like aromatic intensity versus the balance across our range, the delivery of different proof points, our ability to detect maritime influences, or even how peat integration changes with increased air exposure. I suspect the Tuath will excel with our aged Bowmore, where complex integration of flavors benefits from gentler delivery and extended nosing opportunity. For the Octomore, we'll need to decide whether the softer approach enhances the complexity or diminishes impact. This is exactly the kind of practical exploration that makes whiskey tasting endlessly fascinating. It's not just about the liquid, but about how every element of the experience shapes what we perceive and enjoy. Now let's dive a little deeper into the distillery, starting with Caol Ila. Here's a question that fascinates me. How do you become Isla's largest distillery while remaining one of its best-kept secrets? Caol Ila has mastered this paradox over 175 years. Their story reveals something profound about the whiskey industry's hidden infrastructure. When Hector Henderson founded Caol Ila in 1846, he chose a spectacular but challenging location on Isla's northeastern shore. The name means Sound of Islay in Gaelic, referring to the narrow stretch of water separating the island from Jura's distinctive Paps Mountains. What Henderson understood, and what still defines Caol Ila today, is that sometimes the most difficult locations produced the most rewarding results. A turning point came in 1972 with one of whiskey industry's most ambitious rebuilds. Rather than modernizing the existing distillery, Diageo demolished everything and started fresh, scaling from 2 stills to 6 massive copper vessels. But here's what impresses me. They maintained the house style that made the whiskey special in the first place. This is where Caol Ila's story becomes really interesting from a flavor perspective. While their island neighbors emphasize intensity, they focus on sophistication. Those tall, onion-shaped stills with their long necks create extensive copper contact, stripping away harsh compounds while preserving complexity. The result is what master blenders call elegant peat, smoke that enhances rather than dominates. And what most people don't realize is that Caol Ila produces some of the most technically accomplished whiskey in Scotland. That 6.5 million liter annual capacity isn't just about quantity, it's about consistency at scale. Johnny Walker relies so heavily on the distillery precisely because they can deliver predictable character year after year, regardless of weather variations or peat quality fluctuations. This consistency comes from obsessive attention to detail. Long fermentation times and traditional lark washbacks contribute to subtle vanilla and spice notes that complement rather than compete with peat smoke. The water from Loch Namban travels through ancient limestone, picking up minerals that add complexity without overpowering delicate flavors. Independent bottlers like Gordon and McPhail recognize the distillery's potential beyond blending. Their selections often showcase what happens when the sophisticated spirit gets proper single malt treatment, careful cask selection, and patient maturation that allows the whiskey's natural elegance to shine. Tonight, Gordon and McPhail 13-year-old represents this philosophy perfectly. It's the distillery freed from blending constraints, allowed to develop its full character in quality oak. We should taste maritime salinity, gentle smoke, and underlying fruit character that makes it accessible to newcomers while satisfying to Islay lovers. Next up is Bowmore, where tradition is going to meet time. Now, standing in Bowmore's #1 vaults during a storm is one of whiskey's most humbling experiences. You're literally below sea level, surrounded by aging barrels, listening to the Atlantic waves crash against the stone walls that separate you from the ocean. It's impossible not to understand why this whiskey tastes different from anything matured on the mainland. Bowmore's 245-year history isn't about being the oldest licensed distillery on Islay. It's about the patience to let time and place work their magic on whiskey. This is maturation as collaboration with nature, not a conquest of it. David Simpson's decision to establish Bowmore in 1779 reflected practical wisdom that still guides the distillery today. The location provided deep water access for shipping, fresh water from nearby streams, and most importantly, that unique microclimate created by the Loch Indale's sheltered position. What Simpson couldn't have anticipated was how those underground vaults would affect whiskey character. The combination of cool temperatures, high humidity, and that constant salt air infiltration creates maturation conditions that literally cannot be replicated elsewhere. It's not just marketing, it's measurable differences in how whiskey develops over decades. Bowmore maintains one of Scotland's last traditional floor maltings, and watching this process helps you understand why they resist modernization. The malted barley is turned by hand with wooden shields, then dried over peat fires in their iconic pagoda kiln. This isn't nostalgia, it's quality control at the most fundamental level. Modern industrial maltings optimize for efficiency and consistency. Bowmore's traditional approach optimizes for flavor development. They can adjust moisture content, peat exposure, and drying time for each batch, creating the balanced smoke character that defines their house style. Then wartime adds another layer to Bowmore's character. From 1940 to 1943, RAF Coastal Command operated Catalina flying boats from Lockendale, using the distillery as their base. Airmen on anti-submarine patrols would return to find welcome, warmth, and refreshment at Bowmore. Some casks from that era still mature in the warehouses, liquid history from one of Scotland's most dramatic periods. These whiskies carry not just the time's influence, but the weight of the stories from the men who faced uncertain returns from dangerous missions over the Atlantic. Today, Bowmore demonstrates how traditional techniques can evolve without losing essential character. Direct fired stills, long fermentation times, and patient maturation in those legendary coastal warehouses create whiskeys that show their age gracefully. Unlike heavily peated Islay whiskeys that often emphasize youth and intensity, Bowmore expressions improve dramatically with extended maturation. The peat integrates completely with other profiles, creating seamless complexity that rewards contemplative tasting. Tonight's Master Selection 3rd edition at 22 years represents this philosophy at its finest. After more than 2 decades underground in the vault, the peat should have transformed from prominent feature to an integrated element, creating the kind of harmony that only time and patience can achieve. Now, Bruichladdich tells one of my favorite stories in the whiskey world, how perceived weaknesses can become extraordinary strengths. When Mark Rainier and Jim McElwain purchased this mothball distillery in 2001, industry experts thought they were crazy. The equipment was ancient, the location is remote, the business model is uncertain. But 15 years later, Remy Cointreau paid £58 million for what experts called something as worthless. Now, what changed? Bruichladdich proved that innovation doesn't require modernization always. Sometimes it means having the courage to be deliberately different. Now, that story begins in 1881 when 3 Harvey brothers who already owned 2 successful Glasgow distilleries decided that this is a path that they wanted to take. Their decision was to build on Islay, but it wasn't romantic. It was revolutionary. While other island distilleries had evolved from farm buildings, Bruichladdich was purpose-built as a modern facility designed around efficiency and quality. Those famously tall, narrow-necked stills weren't chosen for aesthetics. They were engineered solutions for creating cleaner, more refined spirit than the heavier styles from typical farm distilleries. The Harvey brothers understood that Islay didn't have to mean rustic, and that the insight that still drives Bruichladdich philosophy today. The 2001 revival wasn't just about restarting production, it was about redefining what Scottish whiskey could be. Jim McElwain brought decades of experience from Bowmore, but more importantly, he brought questions. Why did all the bottles look the same? Why didn't distilleries talk about barley sourcing? Why was transparency considered radical? Under McElwain's guidance, Bruichladdich became the first distillery to include detailed provenance information on every bottle, barley variety, harvest date, farm origin, cask details, even bottling dates. This transparency created new conversations about terroir and whiskey production, challenging the assumption that only French winemakers cared about origins. Now, what also impresses me about the modern Bruichladdich is their systemic approach to exploring peat's potential. Rather than settling on one style, they developed 3 distinct product lines that demonstrate the full spectrum of what's possible. Unpeated Bruichladdich shows pure barley and oak character, proving that Islay can produce elegant, refined whiskey without any smoke influence. And these expressions let you taste the island's terroir without the peat's powerful overlay. Now, Port Charlotte, which is a heavily peated range, delivers a serious phenolic intensity while maintaining the underlying sophistication that defines the distillery's character. It's Islay tradition filtered through modern precision. And then there's Octomore, their exploration of peat's absolute limits. These whiskeys push phenolic levels to previously unimaginable extremes while somehow maintaining drinkability and complexity. Now, since Remy Cointreau's acquisition, Bruichladdich has gained resources while maintaining an independent spirit. They're building their own maltings, conducting barley trials on island farmland, and continuing to challenge industry orthodoxy with what constitutes quality whiskey. Tonight's Port Charlotte represents the sweet spot of this philosophy: serious peat, intensity delivered with modern precision. And at 10 years and 100 proof, it should demonstrate how traditional Islay character can be elevated through contemporary understanding of what makes great whiskey. Now, lastly, we're not talking directly about a distillery as much as we are talking about a brand or line extension. And this is Octomore, where they're pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Now, let me start with a question that may sound absurd. What happens when you take the concept of heavily peated whiskey and multiply it by 10? And Octomore is the answer, obviously. It challenges every assumption about balance, drinkability, and the relationship between intensity and quality. And when Jim McWane first conceived Octomore, it wasn't about creating the most extreme whiskey possible, though that's certainly what happened. It was about creating exploration. If subtle peat can enhance whiskey character, what could we learn by pushing phenolic levels to their absolute limits? Octomore expressions regularly exceed 150 ppm, with special releases reaching over 300 ppm. To put this in perspective, the most heavily peated Islay whiskeys hover around 40 to 50 parts per million. We're talking about phenolic levels that should, by all conventional wisdom, create undrinkable industrial solvent. But here's what fascinates me about the Octomore project. It works, not just as a publicity stunt or collector's curiosity, but as genuinely compelling whiskey that demonstrates sophisticated distillation skills and thoughtful maturation strategies. Creating drinkable whiskey at these peat levels requires exceptional precision throughout the production process. Every decision, from malting duration to distillation cuts to cask selection, must account for these massive phenolic loads while preserving underlying complexity. The malted barley is dried entirely over peat fires, ensuring consistent phenolic intensity throughout each grain. But the real skill comes during distillation, where master distillers must separate desirable peat compounds from harsh, bitter elements that would overwhelm anything else. Each Octomore release carries detailed specifications to tell the complete story about production choices. Our 14.1 tonight represents the core expression from the 14th edition, 100% Scottish barley matured in first fill American oak barrels. The numbering system allows enthusiasts to understand exactly what creates each expression's character. 14.2 might explore sherry cask maturation, while 14.3 could feature local Islay barley, and 14.4 might push into virgin oak territory. This systemic approach to extreme peat creates a library of flavor profiles that would be impossible with traditional production methods. Perhaps most surprisingly, Octomore challenges whiskey's fundamental assumption about aging requirements. Most expressions are 5 to 8 years old, proving that exceptional distillation and cask selection can create immediately mature flavors, even at extreme phenolic levels. This discovery has implications far beyond heavily peated whiskey. It suggests that our understanding of what requires long maturation might be more limited than we assumed. Quality wood and precise production can accelerate flavor development in ways that challenge traditional timelines. Our 14.1 at 119.2 proof represents Octomore at its most essential: pure Scottish barley, first fill barrels, 5 years of maturation, and in phenolic levels that should overwhelm everything else. But if Bruichladdich has succeeded, we should taste not just smoke, but complexity underneath that intensity. The key will be patience and water. Octomore demands time to open up and benefits dramatically from careful dilution. This isn't whiskey for quick sips. It's meditation on what's possible when traditional boundaries are systemically dismantled. Let's start our journey gently with this independent bottling that showcased Caol Ila's sophisticated approach to Islay character. On initial nosing, all one word, smoke, salt, pledge, right? There's an immediate hit of that lemon chemically nature that kind of comes into pledge, some smoke and some malt, all mushed in together. And then it immediately goes into like a syrup and herbs, like really strong herbs, you know. It's really not aggressive or overpowering. the tasting on this leans a little bit into the nosing of it, where I get some candied lemon peel or some syrup on a lemon, but then it moves into like a hardwood fire ash, right? Not fruit or tobacco wood, but like a hardwood ash. And then as it finishes out, there's some smoke and some salt and some bitter, but in maybe a smoked salt on citrus pith kind of an idea. And maybe there's even some peppercorn that kind of comes into play. This could be a piece of meat after being cooked, but without the meat flavor, right? So all the things you get from cooking those components on a piece of meat, just remove the smell of the meat. Now, moving on, let's go to the Bowmore Master Selection 3rd Edition. This should be 102 proof at 22 years. Are we sure this isn't a slightly smoked bourbon? This feels like a smoky dark candy. It reminds me of like horehound candy. I've read some notes on this that say pine, but for me it's a mint note. And after the first tasting of it, there is no smoke on this for me. Now, as we taste this, there is peat, but in a tobacco smoke kind of way. There's some citrus pith. There's some cinnamon/white pepper. Sometimes those react the same way on my tongue, at least. And then it goes into like a dark chocolate finish, maybe some dark chocolates, maybe some dark cherries that toy with being sour cherry. Now let's move on to the Bruichladdich Port Charlotte 10-year-old at 100 proof. This is smoke only in the way that smoke is created if you put like a plum or a peach on the grill. Could even be like a green grape or a light citrus. And there could be some wood influence as I'm smelling, not like burnt wood, but just like generic wood experience. The taste on this gives me honeyed tea. It's a more full experience in the mouth than the previous two were, and it drinks at maybe at a higher proof. It's not really like a thick, oily mouthfeel. It's more of a higher proof mouthfeel. There's still some charred fruit that came from the nose onto this, and then it finishes like I would think that a tea cocktail would, and it put me on a path of actually looking to see if there are tea cocktails out there, and I came across like an Earl Grey old fashioned that now I'm really considering. I don't even really like Earl Grey tea, but I want to know what an Earl Grey old fashioned is going to taste like. Now, the last but certainly not least, we're going to go to Octomore 14.1, and I'm going to swirl the hell out of this, right? Because we're at 119.2 proof, and we're at 5 years, but we're also ready for a really potentially extreme experience. Now, we're going to see how the Tuath handles this whiskey at the absolute limits of peat intensity from a nosing perspective. Now, I am not adding any water to this, for sure. Now, the commentary earlier was, you should add water to this, but I'm not going to do that because I'm a glutton for punishment. But the nose on this is honey and light melon and light fruits, and yeah, there's peat here. But maybe because of the progression, the peat isn't as readily apparent, but it's here for sure, right? You're going to have that. But then once you kind of settle into the peat, you get that honey, that light melon, that light fruit. But as you kind of come back, you start to get more of some darker fruits, like maybe some raisins and some vanilla. Now, on the tasting of this, it hits like a pineapple when I think about pineapples and acidity. And there's obviously some smoke. And then there's some honey bun, more of a confectionery type thing. And it finishes. We got into this kick for a little while where we would cook honey buns in a skillet to get them crisped up, and then put vanilla ice cream on top of it. This finishes in the way that a honey bun tasted when it's put in a skillet, like that sugar is heated up and then crystallized. And then you put, the vanilla ice cream over top of it, but like you burnt the sugar just a little bit and the bun just a little bit. Not enough to make it inedible, but enough to add some like carbonized complexity to it. And then as it starts to finish out, I'm getting some bitterness here, maybe some sour oak. And then, as you let it sit for an extended period of time, it's like I just woke up from a camp out and inhaling campfire all night long, right? If you've never had that experience, go have that experience, or drink this whiskey and you can have that experience. Now, what strikes me most about tonight's journey through Isla's peat paradise is how these 4 expressions demonstrate that there's no single way to interpret this remarkable island's character. From Caol Ila's elegant restraint to Octomoore's phenolic extremism, each distillery has found its own authentic voice within Isla's shared identity. The Tuath glass proved an interesting companion for this exploration. Its gentler delivery enhanced my appreciation of the Bowmore, but even of the Octomoore and its phenolic approach. I suspect a traditional Glencairn might have had a different outcome, as would any particular glassware. But that's kind of the experiment here that we're doing, is how do different glasses impact different spirits. Now, what unites all of these whiskeys, regardless of their different approaches, is their authentic connection to place. Isla's ancient peat, Atlantic storms, island culture. They've all not just shaped the island, but the whiskey and the people who make it. This authenticity cannot be manufactured elsewhere. Now, thanks for tuning in to this episode from the Embellished Pod. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform you're consuming this on and leave a comment if at all possible. You can hit me up on social media on TikTok or Instagram using Embellished Pod and give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I can be found at www.embellishedpod.com with all of my links, accounts, contact details, and more. Thanks for stopping by.